A hearty welcome to our speaker Jérôme Tagger, CEO of Preventable Surprises, a think tank that focuses on sustainability and responsible investments. Jérôme explores the intersection of financial markets and society. He joined Preventable Surprises as CEO in 2020 after 15 years of field building in responsible finance. He was a director at the Global Impact Investing Network, the founding COO of the UN-backed Principles for Responsible Investment, head of research at EuroZIF and chief revenue officer at Impact Alpha, and an advisor at UNEP FI and the World Benchmarking Alliance. On ethics and compliance, he is of the opinion that ask not what ethics can do for your company, ask what your company can do for ethics.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be in Munich today and to be around so many fantastic speakers, and hopefully you're enjoying this conversation. Responsible investment is going through a tough time. ESG these days in America is denounced as a political ploy. In Europe, there's a convergence of policy pressure to address greenwashing, which is creating a lot of headaches. Now, arguably, if there were fewer headaches, less greenwashing, there would be fewer headaches. But bigger picture, the media and the public are asking questions. How is this whole thing serving us? How is it serving society and the environment? And this is a very, very challenging time, and some people think ESG is coming to an end, is in the valley of death. Others think it's going through the trough of expectations, meaning it's being challenged and getting ready to evolve into the next phase. I think ESG is exactly where you could expect it to be at this point in time. And I will tell you one thing, I do not expect the responsible investment or ESG conversation to become easier, much as we would like to, and much as the service industry around responsible investment is trying to facilitate that. I also believe that ESG is often a vast misunderstanding. And to explain why, I'm going to do a very shortcut, very brief history of ESG the way I see it. There's going to be a lot of shortcuts, but I hope the story holds true altogether. So ideas of responsible business and finance, they're not new. They go back decades, centuries. We all have bits and pieces of that story. They take on a different resonance in the 90s through in the neoliberal order after the fall of the German Wall, and at a time when globalization accelerates. And it accelerates in the context, well, in a variety of ways, in terms of global supply chains. It accelerates in terms of technology. It accelerates in terms of our general consciousness of global issues like climate change. And that, I think, is particularly important as a context. Now, what happens from here is also that when we look at these issues, we find that they're no longer the premise of one particular country or one particular political, societal system, right? We have lots of issues that cross jurisdictions, that fall between the tracks of regulation, and we're finding governments increasingly challenged to address these issues, and I would even say, as we look back at the past 20 years, being increasingly in a reactive position, reacting to change, reacting to climate change, reacting to wars and energy crisis, reacting to pandemics, reacting to a digital time that is much faster than the time of political action. And it is in this context that all of this emerges. Now, sorry, I'm just fumbling with my talking cards here. Business and companies were quickly identified in this as fundamental actors of globalization, of that change, of carbon emissions, and so on. And in the early 90s, mid-90s, and early 2000s, there was a lot of the activism around corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility. And companies, and this here is the historical shortcut, one of the things I would say is, look, we can only do so much. We're accountable to our shareholders. Our shareholders make all the decisions, and don't ask us things. Ask someone else. And that's where activism essentially started really turning to investors. Now, there was a lot of socially responsible investment before here and there, but it wasn't a global movement yet. And the United Nations, UN Global Compact, the UNEP Finance Initiative, and other groups started honing in on institutional investors and the power of capital. And one of those engagement strategies fundamentally became ESG. Now, there were other acronyms before ESG. Some used the word ethical, that's gone. Some used the word economic, that's gone too. There's a whole, I could speak another 15 minutes just on this. I will skip it for your benefit, but ESG became a thing. And I think what's really interesting here is to think about what ESG was at that moment. It's not just a set of issues. It's a way to get investors interested. It's a way, you could call it a bait, you could call it an offering, or a translation of sustainability to get investors engaged into sustainability conversation. And so from my perspective, when you ask me what is ESG, I will tell you it's a negotiation, right? Other people will tell you, it's issues, it's processes, it's whatever it is. But for me, fundamentally, that's all true. But even truer is the fact that it is a negotiation. It's a way to facilitate a conversation between different groups. And so, as part of this engagement, the principles for responsible investment were developed and bring the United Nations and big institutions around the table. And one of the biggest things that happened at this time was that the asset owners, the big pension funds and insurance companies and others within ESG started asking questions from their managers. They said, well, we're not sure what to do, so let's ask our managers. Hi, manager, what are you doing about ESG? Well, what do the asset managers do? They turn to the companies. They said, hey, companies, what are you doing about ESG, right? And so that's the dynamic by which ESG spread worldwide. And that notions of corporate social responsibility, corporate sustainable responsibility, whatever it was, slowly faded away, and ESG became a thing. And I can tell you that a decade ago, I think I honestly knew everyone that has ESG in their job title, and now I don't. Far from it. Now, I think what I want to hone in on here a little bit is all the assumptions that were made in building this architecture to get investors to the table of responsible investment. I think one of the fundamental expectations is that this would get investors to become more activists, more like activists, like get them to use their power, their powers of governance, their financial power to change corporate behavior. And that companies would essentially respond to this either because of reputational risk or because they wanted to access to capital. Now, there are examples where this has happened, but there are very few. And in fact, you could say that very few financial institutions have actually made the leap to become activists. And you could debate whether that's desirable or even possible, but that is a fact. There are also some very interesting cultural dimensions to this mainstreaming of institutional ESG. One that I keep being struck by is how it brings together people with very different lenses. You could talk about the climate people and the labor and social issues and human rights people and the governance people, and they often argue about things. But also within the financial system, what's interesting is that it brings people with a transaction lens, people that do deals, people that are investors, and people with a governance lens, people who think about the accountability of companies. And I'm finding that they don't always speak the same language. And that's an issue also as we think about the next phase of responsible investment that I think needs to be addressed. Another one is the specificities of different cultures and different countries and economies engaged in sustainable development. And some of them are slightly more interested in development at the moment, and some of them are slightly more interested in sustainability. They have a hard time talking to one another. And in the European and Western history of ESG, what's also always struck me is how there were very strong Anglo-Saxon influences and more continental influences. Forgive the shortcuts here again. But in one world, this idea of ESG is playing out in fairly liquid, equity-driven markets with arm's-length relationships between the investors and the companies. And in another, what you're seeing is something that's a bit more messy. You're seeing a debt-driven world. You're seeing a strong position of banks. You're seeing a close involvement of the government in economic decision-making and so on. That is, and then multiply this by all the different economic systems and governance systems in the world, but that is also an arena for confusion, misunderstanding, and missed expectations. I think for those of you who are familiar with, say, the engagements that many British or Anglo-Saxon investors have done with German companies like Volkswagen over the past 15 years, that's a great example of cultural challenges in these conversations. Besides these cultural questions, it's interesting to think a little bit about ideology, or maybe expectations about what happens in the world, if we don't want to use ideology as a term. But in all of this, in all this dynamic, there's a little bit of an expectation that you go out, you change corporate behavior one company at a time, and that aggregated together represents a changing world. And there's nothing entirely wrong with that, although you never know what happens in these sort of complex systems. But one thing that it does is that it reinforces the primacy and the particular position of power of shareholders in these conversations. Is that desirable? I would like to discuss it. But it's a big piece of this. And then the other ideological dimension is this deep belief in the power of transparency, right? And if we think about what the ESG world has become, it is transparency, it is disclosure. I'm sure a lot of you here have ESG jobs, and I'm sure that a lot of your time is spent on reporting, on disclosing, on conversing with others about what is it that you're doing. Is that strategy? Is that the best allocation of your time? I don't know, but I think it's something to be discussed. And it's concerning in many ways that this has become the norm and the practice of ESG. It's created a giant data crunching machine. Some people call it the ESG data industrial complex. But data will only take you so far. And I think in many ways, some of the issues we face here is that we don't know what we're looking for. We don't know the questions to ask. As we see how rapidly our world is changing, translating that into corporate behavior, that's challenging. So sure, there'll be more data, and we'll talk about it some more, but it's not the be-all and end-all, and frankly, quite often, it's a good way to kick the can down the road and avoids dramatic changes. I'm going to skip a bit of my fascinating comments about the state of and the practice of responsible investment. I want to talk about voluntary action and voluntary schemes. That also, in the background, has been the big driver of practice at the corporate level with the principles for responsible investment, with all the current net zero strategies, right? It all starts with voluntary. Why? Because regulation is either not possible or not desirable. And that we think it's a good way to get people engaged into a direction. But then things get muddy. First of all, sometimes the ask is a little bit too easy. It's voluntary, do what you want. And then some people come and say, and I experienced this when I worked at the Principles for Responsible Investment, people would come to me and say, what do I need to do to comply with the principles? And I would say, well, I don't know, it's up to you. And that conversation didn't always go particularly well. And what happens after that is obviously that things get even muddier because people start doing things, but then they start talking about what they're doing. Or sometimes, unfortunately, talking about things that they're not really doing. That's a whole other conversation. And that's where regulation steps in, right? And then what starts as voluntary becomes regulation about speaking about the voluntary and communicating about the voluntary, because you're falling into much more regulated and compliance territory. I would say it's worth thinking about whether that's useful and whether that's really focusing the conversations about ESG on what would really need to happen or what would be interesting in terms of development. I want to go back briefly to this notion of negotiation that I brought up at the beginning of this conversation. It's a very imperfect descriptor. In fact, if there is a negotiation, it is extremely skewed and fraught. First of all, if you go outside of our own heads, it's not like there is a nice negotiation between the private sector and the public sector and civil society. No, it's heterogeneous, it's complex. People come at this with different needs, with different interests, right? And there is no one that is in a position to facilitate a global negotiation. It's a set of different tables where this is happening, even if the language is increasingly uniform. It's tempting to become very solipsistic about this, but reality is it's very good at reminding us that that doesn't work. The other thing is that not everyone is negotiating in good faith. It goes back to the point about voluntary approaches, but obviously a lot of people come at this table as a way to gain time and kick the can down the road. And then also not everyone is at the table, right? And that's the big current debates about diversity and inclusion, among others. But the power relationships in the ESG conversations are skewed. It is between individuals. It is also between financial institutions and countries. Some of the world's largest financial institutions have economic power larger than medium-sized country. And then this negotiation also has tended to pretend that regulation doesn't exist. That's changing, but I think that's been a big issue, and we see every day that the public has a strong appetite for policy making. Lastly, I will say that investors, some of them, my best friends, are investors, as we say, but they have also reasons and incentives to dislike sustainability or ESG. Mostly they're not paid to care. Second, I think they can easily, through the woolly narratives that are created about doing well by doing good and so on. And third, they can benefit from social dislocation, for example, for betting against currencies in ways that markets do, regardless of ESG commitments. So what happens from here? And I think the fundamental point is none of this is easy. Anybody's trying to pitch you a simple solution, it's not going to work. There's a lot of organizations, funds, and companies that are doing really good work, that are doing their best, and there's spectacular talents in this field. That is something that always brings warmth to my heart, is the drive and the talents and the skills of people who do this. But there are no easy solutions. Now, there is currently a focus on impact, and what impact are we having in the world? Real-world impact is a term that I hope disappears because it's ugly. Now, that's great. Very happy for people to do more impact investments. But again, this sort of narrative just reinforces the power of investors. You can only take it so far. Second, systems approaches, that's increasingly popular. How to think about sustainability, ESG, behavior change beyond the simple relationship between investors and companies. That's a helpful way to bring questions of policies, questions of stakeholders and others, and more complexity fundamentally into the conversation. Easy it is not, but it is necessary. I think one thing that's important to me is try to re-anchor finance into reality, whether it's based on territories, on supply chains, on sectors, on ecosystems, on critical sectors, but just finding ways to relates the abstractions of ESG and finance to the realities of the experience that we have on the ground. Now, saying this, I go back to the theme of the conference and taking a step back for a second for the last minute I have. I don't think anyone here is forced to be good. I think the world is very reactive in its approach to, oh dang, we have all these asks and public pressure and we need to react. But I do think that to be able to do good or any kind of good, finance and the ESG fields writ large need to be much more proactive in squaring up to their own beliefs and all the assumptions that I've talked about, because they are in the way of providing better responses to the world. It needs better cultural sensitivity, it needs better power sharing, and certainly needs a lot of creativity. If I have a concern about responsible finance and ESG, is that it tends to obscure the larger conversation about the responsibility of the financial sector and the role of finance in the world. When Republican state treasurers in the world called out ESG on the grounds that it's political, I think they miss a point. The point is that finance is political. The point is that what gets financed is what shapes society. And that is the practical thing that is happening and where things take a political turn. And so the real question is that a good guide? And how might our culture shape better markets? Do institutional investors understand the Anthropocene and the risks associated with the current disruption? What is their role in exacerbating them? And what can they do to mitigate them? these are the real questions that I hope the finance sector really tries to address going forward alongside the pressure of its stakeholders. Thank you so much for your attention.